It is January 22nd, 2020, and you are listening to episode 3 of the Mid-Season Replacements podcast. I am your host, Randy Dankievitch, the TV editor of Goomba Stomp and the writer of TV Never Sleeps. And with me, as always, joining me on this week's Journey to the Stars are, I don't have a good title for you this week, Sean Colletti.
That's right. I don't need a good title. I'm ill this week, so you're going to be doing most of the talking, I think.
You're ill as in, like when Redman used to say that's ill?
In every sense of the word.
Before we get into what we're talking about this week, which, spoilers, we're going to go to space and talk about space science fiction and kind of where it is in today's television landscape, because it's kind of in a weird place compared to where it's been the last 20 years. And then we're also going to talk about the two shows that led us to this larger conversation. The Expanse's 4th season, which premiered recently on Amazon, which I also reviewed at Goomba Stomp. And then Lost in Space's 2nd season, which premiered on Christmas Eve, I believe. So we're going to talk about those two shows, but first, I'll just let everybody know if you want to reach us, if you have any questions you want us to read on air, you have any comments you want us to read off, you have any music you want us to play on the show. We like to feature different artists when they want to promote their stuff on our show. We can be reached at the mid-season replacements at gmail.com. We're at midseason pod on Twitter. I'm at RJ Dank. We're on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Just Google the Mid-Season Replacements podcast and you should run into us pretty quickly. So no need to waste time. That's out of the way. People know where to find us. They already know who we are. Let's talk about science fiction. And specifically, I think what this conversation more focuses around is science fiction kind of as a whole, not necessarily kind of, I look at space science fiction as two things in television today. There's Star Trek and Star Wars that are kind of always going to be there and persistent in the culture. You know, we had about a decade period where there wasn't a Star Trek show, but we're about to have two. I'm so sure we're going to get more in the future. There's plenty of Star Wars series, but what I kind of mainly want to focus on is everything else that's on television, which, as Sean, I think you were the one who noted this, that kind of kicked off this conversation. There really isn't a lot of it left.
No. Science fiction is such a broad term that a lot of shows that we don't think of as sci-fi get lumped into the genre. So technically, all superhero shows basically are science fiction. But I think when we think about sci-fi as a genre, we'd think of space stuff. Either things that happen in outer space and on other planets, or that involve things from outer space coming to Earth. And there hasn't been a lot of that stuff on TV recently. In fact, the main sci-fi network has lost most of its original programming. The one with
the actual sci-fi in its name?
Yeah. Which is weird. Like, historically in visual media and TV since the 20s, like even in silent films, horror and sci-fi have been the biggest genres, from Nosferatu and Metropolis, and you can trace it really heavily in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Yeah, definitely. And sci-fi is the one out of those two genres that actually does well on television. Star Trek's success is testament to that. Its different variations. And I think one of the two shows that we talked about that we're going to be talking about, started out really, really well as a modern... It's an adaptation, so it would be unfair to call it an original sci-fi series. But something not based off of either of those two big properties that you mentioned. It's just harder and harder to find those things, and I wonder if the superhero glut has kind of pushed it to the side for the moment, or if it's generally something that audiences don't get on with as much as they used to.
Well, I think when you talk about the superhero effect, I think that really is a big part of it, because I think a lot of not just people that watch television, but more importantly, television executives think superhero covers science fiction, especially with stuff like, I guess maybe the easiest example would be like Guardians of the Galaxy, because that is space science fiction, but it is also a show with superheroes on it. And at the end of the day, the superhero stuff kind of supersedes the science fiction stuff and the space stuff, which is the stuff that we're trying to focus on here. So I think a lot of it disqualifies itself because its attention is not being paid to the experience of being in space. It is space as kind of background dressing rather than an actual topic, which, once you put those qualifiers on the genre, which I think, are necessary and not just kind of some bullshit we're not making a bullshit metrics here. Like you said, the format of space science fiction and the kind of stories it entails have been something that have been part of our culture for about 100 years at this point. And if we break down the lists of shows that are really about exploring space, I think there's really 6 left on television. Is Lost in Space and The Expanse. There's, I guess you can count, there's a few more if you count the Star Trek and Star Wars series. If you count Discovery and Picard, which starts this week, and The Mandalorian, though, I think we kind of we're stretching the definitions of space sci-fi when the kind of space sci-fi we're specifically talking about. I guess you should say exploratory sci-fi is kind of what we're thinking about, because The Mandalorian's more of a character-based Western show. I think it kind of falls it's closer to Guardians of the Galaxy than it would be, say, Lost in Space or something. And then we have the Orville, which kind of is it is a space show. It's a comedy version of Star Trek. And then Final Space and Dark Matter, which is a show you mentioned that I'm actually not very familiar with, but that's kind of it. I'm not going to count the Battlestar Galactica reboot that's in process or any of that kind of stuff. Since the days of Battlestar and of the one season of Firefly that people won't shut the fuck up about, and the end of sci-fi, there really hasn't been a lot of this space science fiction. And maybe it's just a matter of budgets. Maybe it's because, when you spend all this money on superhero shows, you don't have money to do, to make big CGI planets and stuff like that.
Those 2 shows that you just mentioned should have signaled to me a bigger popularity than exists now. We talked a bit about the canon of television last week, and Battlestar Galactica, since it aired, has been in that discussion of the dozen or so best shows. And like you said, people really love that one and only season of Firefly. And now, in the wake of Game of Thrones, which I'm sorry for listeners, but we'll probably keep coming back to that forever, the foundation for something like a long-term space opera exists, and a budget for those kinds of things, if the right creative team is behind it, really should be there. It's just might be a matter of nobody having that one either great adaptation of a familiar property or the one original thing that's going to somehow suck people in. I'm not sure if those things exist in sci-fi as plentifully as they do in fantasy. There are probably still a couple other really big fantasy series that would do really well, and beyond the video game series StarCraft, I'm not sure what other narrative-based sci-fi series, maybe Mass Effect, maybe it is video games actually, that they ought to be looking at adapting.
Well, you think about a game like, I think you could take the concept of something like No Man's Sky and turn that into an interesting, engaging television series, I think even Lost in Space, with kind of the mystery elements of it, we'll talk later about whether it's good at that or not, but it certainly has the elements of that. Sometimes I wonder if it's even just a socio-political thing, like from the 30s to to the 80s, to the 90s, really, we were a culture that was all about expanding our knowledge of space and constantly wondering about what is beyond our own atmosphere. And I think over time, just look at the influence that NASA has on our culture now and how little they kind of do as an organization to kind of expand the bounds of our knowledge, and how willing we are to, as a country, to put our resources into something like that. So, I wonder if sometimes it's something that's part of a larger trend where we've become a little more introverted as a society, as a world, and we don't have the capacity in our minds to think about the great unknown and traveling billions of light years away and what that entails. But then, you can argue that on the other hand, we were making shows like Star Trek before we could really even get into space, and the fertile ground for, exploring how society operates is still relevant, and I think especially a show like The Expanse, especially early on, does a great job of like, let's take society and use space as a petri dish to explore how human connections work, how science works, how things like that go on. And I wonder if it's kind of a two-pronged thing. If one, the superhero glut and honestly, the fantasy element of that you mentioned has kind of overtaken that as kind of our culture's interests. Stuff like saga in comic books still exists, but even that, I feel like the number of interesting space sci-fi series has dwindled in recent years. And beyond even the games, Mass Effect has not really been a relevant series for a long time. Dead Space is, like its name suggests, no longer in existence. We are at a weird crossroads with how we think about space, how much as a society we're interested in space, and I think it's starting to be reflected in our visual fiction.
I think that socio-political context, that's such a good point. That it's not necessarily to do with our capacity to think about any of this. It's really just the evolution of it has become to where we are now, which is a place of disinterest, which is really sad because so many of those series and so much of life, especially in America, used to be full of a lot of amazement and curiosity about what space entailed, and now that people's preoccupations are much more terrestrial, to the point where we kind of need that nostalgia that we've been talking about, which a lot of the fantasy stuff provides. It's kind of, it's just a sad state of these things not interesting us and wowing us in the way that they ought to.
It's one of those things too that you may not really notice, but when you kind of brought it up as a topic for us to talk about, like, hey, there's really not a lot of space science fiction going on, I stopped to think about, like, where was television 25, 30 years ago? And then I think about it, and it was like Xena and Hercules, and then 14 different space franchises. There was Star Trek, there was Deep Space Nine was its own thing, right? That wasn't a Star Trek show.
Stargate, SG-1.
Stargate, yep. There's one other big one, Farscape, that's another one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there was just all these different franchises that followed in the same blueprint. It was almost like, kind of like the Law and Order or the Chicago universe that we have now, where all these shows, they didn't overlap like the Chicago shows do, but it was a format that was respected and enjoyed by everyone, and offered and captured something about, like you said, the optimism of possibility that space offered us as a society. It wasn't necessarily just escapist art. It was art that actually posited questions. The original Star Trek is really the blueprint for this, as television that kind of goes beyond the bounds of just being a vehicle for advertising. I feel like, there's other examples we could point to earlier in television's history, but Star Trek's iconic for a reason, and it's not just because people like nerdy science facts. It was because those shows offered a prism for us to explore our own values and how that translates in a strange space, or even just like I said, using the universe as a petri dish. And I wonder if, as television has moved towards a more like individual based like morality case, it becomes a character by character thing rather than a collective understanding of how society operates, if that plays into it as well. Because I'd even argue that the Expanse and Lost and Space are shows that have interesting ideas about community and how that operates in an unknown world, and how that plays with how important community is to human evolution in strange spaces. But there's something to be said about how those shows are so character focused that they also individualize those journeys, which kind of it robs it a little bit. The Expanse is very effective. It's the one show that I think is extremely effective at balancing those lines. But I do feel like there may just be less interest in examining what society does as a whole, because the examples that we have are just so depressing that we don't want to explore that anymore.
Yeah, and most great genre shows use their genres as trappings, so they are ultimately character-based. The ones that kind of lean too heavily on genre tropes or the world building at the expense of these kinds of inquiries into communities within these worlds usually end up being pretty boring. So it must have something to do with the setting. The spaceship or the other the planet outside of the solar system, anything that isn't Earth, becomes less interesting as a place to look at human interaction than our day-to-day life, which is weird because it feels more and more like people are moving towards TV for escapism, the general viewing public, which that kind of trend should allow for more types of shows that take place somewhere strange, and we're not really seeing that.
No, instead we get shows like the Orville, which are, I can't really speak to the Orville's quality because I haven't seen more than a handful of episodes of it, but it is a nostalgia play wrapped in a fancy space science fiction wrapper. Like, it is kind of just a series of jokes that have been made about existing media, Star Trek for 40 or 50 years. I can't really speak to the details of it or whether it adds anything to that conversation, but I just feel like as a whole, there's so little of this specific type of fiction, which, kind of defines the certain eras of American cinema, whether it's the 60s in television or like the mid 70s. A lot of people will define the 70s as kind of the decade the crime genre got perfected and indie cinema went mainstream for a little while. But I also think it was a golden age for space science fiction, and yeah, we just don't have that today. Outside of the two shows we're about to talk about, and Battlestar Galactica. I mean, what space show is really a must-watch series from the past 20 years? I mean, I would personally argue that people should watch Other Space, but even again, that's just a kind of a Star Trek parody that's less about space exploration and society than it is kind of just a running series of jokes.
Even Battlestar Galactica, honestly, it has its place amongst these other big TV shows because of when it came out. But if something like Battlestar came out now, it would kind of just be among the, those 3 or 4 dozen very good shows that come out every year. But I don't think that it would stand out in the same way that it did when it came out.
Yeah, I think part of that comes from, like, Battlestar in particular. I think, it was a great show for a majority of its run, a really legitimately great show, but I don't think that show would get put together the way that it was then. I don't think that show's pilot would be as like brazenly dramatic or like kind of unconventional as it is. Like that show ends Earth in the first 10 minutes of its existence and then spends the next 2 hours observing the fallout while still threatening to end the entire reality of the series in the first 2 hours. And I feel like most shows aren't brave enough to do that now. So like Battlestar is kind of like you said, it's kind of an icon of its time because wouldn't stand out today because there are so many other shows that do similar things well, and also it wouldn't be able to be constructed the way it is today. And I mean, I think you can turn to something like Lost in Space as a great counterexample because the amount of story that Battlestar Galactica goes through in its first 3 episodes is more world building, mythology, and character than a show like Lost in Space offers in 2 entire seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so now I wonder, there are some people that may argue that we're kind of in the middle of a renaissance with The Expanse and Lost in Space and the return of Star Trek to prominence and other shows that are coming out like the Orville recently, or Avenue 5 just debuted on HBO, and then there's the upcoming Mike Schur and Steve Carell are getting together to do a comedy based on the actual Space Force that the United States has apparently started, which I still don't believe is a real thing. Apparently they have uniforms that are camouflaged, which, I mean, if we're going to do it, we might as well do it that way, right? Got to camouflage yourself in space.
Yeah.
But again, people may point to that being a renaissance, but I think if you look at the actual subject matter, it's The Expanse, it's kind of Lost in Space, and then everything else is not really space science fiction. It's, for the most part, it's just straight up comedy.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple other examples. There were a few shorts in the Love, Death, Robots miniseries that were kind of space-based, but those things were no more than 10 minutes long, so there wasn't a lot of time. And most of that series is more interested in like artificial intelligence and stuff anyway. Yeah, it's a weird time to enjoy space science fiction, and I feel like that's why we only hear about stuff like, oh, Quentin Tarantino might direct a Star Trek, and oh, what's the next Star Wars series we're going to look for? Because people are so desperate to find something interesting in the genre that we are now generating stories to try and create interest. Like, oh, Noah Hawley's going to write the next Star Trek movie, and it's like, who gives a fuck? What's interesting out there? Who's trying to do something different with the format besides, just doing more Star Treks? I think even if we dug into Star Trek and talked about Discovery, I think the Star Trek Discovery is a bit of a misleading title for that show, and it doesn't really have the same feel that, it's so serialized that it doesn't have nearly the same feel that the original Star Trek series would have.
No, not at all. That's something, the serialization versus I don't know, mission of the week is something that I'm sure this discussion is going to be touching on. And maybe that's another thing, viewers' tastes have changed with regard to that as well.
Which, hey, changing viewer taste is great. I still think there's a space for space, but I don't know, it's kind of weird. I think we've drilled down on like the big challenges that the genre faces, but how do they exceed that? Are we just doomed to get endless Star Trek reboot after endless Star Trek reboot until the end of time? Like you said, I don't know if there's I'm sure there's good space science fiction out there. I'm sure that there are great books and series out there, but quite frankly, I don't have time to read them or do enough research to understand them and point my finger and say, this is what we need to be adapting. Because honestly, if people I'm sure when The Expanse got announced as a series, people were looking at that and saying, no, you can't turn that into the series. But I don't think we can use The Expanse as kind of a blueprint for other shows to succeed on, because it threads so many different needles at the same time. It's able to operate as a hard ass, like this, The Expanse has some hard ass science in it, but it's also a character show. It's also a show that has like some really, really interesting things to say about our modern society. other shows don't need to follow that blueprint, but I don't think the Orville / Avenue 5 / Space Force, let's turn it into a satire blueprint, is A, sustainable, B, all that interesting at this point.
No. And you've seen more of The Expanse than I have, but I feel like the two shows on discussion here also, this is kind of us looking at what's there and maybe making more of it than it actually is, because I don't think either of these shows anymore are ones that are must watch.
Oh, you just blasted me with a hot take 25 minutes into the episode. No warning. Okay, so you know what, I think we can just kind of get into it here, because I think as we frame this conversation, I think we have I think the two shows we picked are perfect examples to examine this issue through, because you have The Expanse, which, like I said, is kind of all of these ideas put together. It's got the hard-ass science where, you can tell that these people do their research on theoretical physics and shit like that, even though we're way beyond the bounds of what humans can actually understand. The science on The Expanse is logical, it's explained in an interesting way, and it makes sense. It makes sense that the things that they do would work and the logic that they get there. The show does a great job of establishing that. It's also got some of the best character work on television. That is, The Expanse Ensemble is one of my favorite ensembles to watch on television, even in a season like the most recent season, which if we wanted to go off on tangents, I could argue is the weakest season of the series. But then on the other hand, you have Lost in Space, which kind of tries to thread the needle between being a Mission of the Week show and being that serialized show. And I think some of that comes from its own existence as an influential 60s science fiction series, and then its attempts to try and become a Netflix show now. And I think even more granularly, if we compare the first two seasons of Lost in Space, you can see the difference in why and what works in space science fiction and what doesn't. But yeah, I mean, I'll just kick it right off by saying that I think The Expanse fucking rocks. I think particularly seasons 2 and 3 are absolutely phenomenal works of television, and how they are able to build a dramatic crescendo without losing sight of characters, or more importantly, the sociological implications of its narrative storytelling, which can be hard to capture on a show that's trying to tell a story about billions and billions of people through the lens of a dozen characters. And I think on the other hand, I think Lost in Space is an abject failure at doing those things, that it is so focused on being a story about this one family that not only does it give way too much time to this family that is not really all that interesting on the surface, but then it kind of fails itself as being an interesting story about space exploration, because it bogs itself down in the serialized bullshit of having robot mythology.
It also fails as a Mission of the Week series because it doesn't understand what makes that format interesting.
It's formulaic as shit.
A big part of what makes seeing the same crew do a different objective each week is that you have an interesting crew, but also that something in that objective challenges one or more of the characters in interesting ways. And so much of Lost in Space is kind of just throwing these meaningless conflicts, injuring somebody in some way so that, they're physically incapable of being 100% for part of the episode, and a lot of the rest of that episode is the other characters trying to heal them or save them in some way.
It's exhausting.
Yeah, the conflicts that get thrown at the characters in Lost in Space, it actually gets kind of comical, I think, and in ways that make me wonder. It feels like a family show, although there are certain aspects of it that are probably not so family friendly. But in terms of like intellectual depth, there's nothing really there's absolutely that in The Expanse, and there's practically none of it in Lost in Space, but it dresses itself as a very slick production that seems to have those kinds of aims, but actually isn't asking any of those questions whatsoever, and all of the conflict is just really surface level, and this new creature or problem with the atmosphere or whatever it is just so happens to be an issue this week, and so now we're going to spend that time solving it, where one of our antagonists is going to get in the way in some way. And I feel like you could, plot those things on a graph, and most of those graphs would look very similar.
Oh yeah, I think the narrative construction of basically every single episode of Lost in Space is exactly the same. It was a little bit more drawn out in season 1 when the episodes were fucking 60 minutes long each, and they were stuck on one planet. At least in season 2, they're in space for most of it, which helps. But I think, just in a broad sense, if we strip away what The Expanse does well with characters and science that Lost in Space doesn't, I think what The Expanse does well is giving weight to its dramatic escalation. In Lost in Space's case, every fucking episode is a absolute doomsday scenario. Life or death, everybody's going to die, nobody's going to survive, main characters are going down, robots are bad, shit's fucked up. Like, everything's so bad, and it happens so repetitively that things go from bad to worse to oh my god, we can't find our way back, to, oh, it's fine, the robot made his face turn blue, we're good. That, like, it's impossible for it to have any meaning or for it to be worth investing in at all. And I think what The Expanse does, in great contrast to that, is that it is so good at building arcs out. Like, most of The Expanse's stories, like its big narrative stories, are half-season-long stories. There's the overarching thing with the proto-molecule and eventually with the rings and all that kind of stuff. But as a series, every season is pretty much broken up in half, save for the most recent season, which I think it suffers from not doing that, where it has a story it tells in the first half, and the climax of that story leads directly into what the second half of the season is doing. And I think that splitting the difference between having your missions of the week, because The Expanse still has, especially in the 4th season, has, okay, here's the problem we need to solve this week. Which, that's an easy, consistent way to build out a dramatic story. I'm not trying to say that we need to reinvent the wheel here, but where The Expanse is interesting is in between those spaces of convention, and where Lost in Space fails is by adhering to those conventions, all while waving its arms and trying to say, look how radical and different we are. Like, it's not that, and it tries to be that. And I think that's where I get frustrated. And I think that's where I get frustrated with a lot of space science fiction these days, is that it very literally feels the pressure of being out in the great void and the need to try and find something big to tether itself to. And Lost in Space, it's this robot mythology that makes no fucking sense and has absolutely no bearing on how this series should operate, even though it completely defines everything about that show in ways that are utterly inexplicable. And on The Expanse, for the most part, if we compare the alien to the proto-molecule is a device for The Expanse to widen its viewer's scope of thinking, which allows it just a bigger possibility of space of what it can do. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that space science fiction, by nature of it being untethered to a reality that we're all familiar with, is that it has this huge possibility space for telling stories and exploring funhouse mirror versions of our society. And The Expanse doesn't necessarily grab onto that in big ways a lot of the time, but when it does, I think it's when it's at its most powerful, like when it's like the dedication The Expanse goes through to describe and convey belter culture throughout the years. I think that is extremely powerful and has a lot to say about political movements and the power of a collective consciousness, or our shared responsibility of morality to each other. And I think that's what great science fiction, space science fiction in particular, does, And by contrast, I think Lost in Space is everything that modern space science fiction has turned into post. I mean, I guess really all television is post Lost if we're thinking about it, because space science fiction suddenly, even Battlestar Galactica, became about these mysteries, about unlocking these mysteries of the universe that need to be solved. The Expanse has it, but again, up until recently, I think The Expanse did a great job at making that kind of the driver of everything else. And once those narrative mystery boxes become how you define your show, then we're just watching Westworld. Nobody wants to watch Westworld.
I wonder if the scope in The Expanse might be too big. What you were saying about when it's at its best, I totally agree. There are so many characters and ideas at play in The Expanse, though, that it's really difficult for them to pay each thing its dues.
Well, I think you see that really well this season with a character like Bobby and the whole story of Mars completely losing its identity as a mission, as a planet, as a society, as a culture.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of gets superseded by all of this shit that's happening on Ilias. Is that what they called it? I already forgot. It's been 2 weeks since I've watched the season, and I've already forgotten what they called it. But what they call the planet that they're the Belter settlers and the scientists, the mercenary-led scientist group, are fighting over. I think I said already, I think this season of The Expanse is the weakest, and I think it's because it adheres more to the guidelines of something like Lost in Space than it does to its own rules for world building and character.
How would you define those rules?
Whew, that's a good question. I think so. When I look at what doesn't work for me in this season of The Expanse, it not only does it kind of the whole experiment feel like an incomplete thought, but I feel like the shift towards being a show that's driven by its exploration of things that are known to others but not known to us, particularly this whole proto-molecule. And I think you're right when you said the show's scope got too big. As it went on, the show's scope got bigger. I think once the introduction of the rings was a fascinating idea because it forced 3 different communities of humanity to come together and find a common ground, even if only temporarily, to kind of halt just a rush of ideas and concepts that nobody could understand. Like the opening of the rings kind of was a massive expansion of the Expanse's universe. This was a show that spent multiple episodes on an asteroid and another half a season just on one ship. And, a lot of the times, even though there are a lot of characters on that show and it goes to a lot of locations, it's still a very focused series. But once we got beyond the ring, the possibility space was open, but it became too much space. And I think maybe that's what scares away people from making shows like this, is that there's too much possibility, so it's too hard to focus. But I do think early on, the first season, while it's not the best season of the series, is so hyper-focused on the crew of the Rocinante, and as an extension of that, of Avasarala, that I think it has a completely different tenor and rhythm than, season 4 does. Season 2 and 3 slowly build themselves out, but again, I think it is using the driving forces of individual characters' journeys to illuminate these larger queries about society, civilization, evolution, the role of science in helping us define our own morality and the limits of what we will expose ourselves to as a society, I think was extremely powerful and something that was lost in this most recent season.
Even in that first one, though, which is focused, you have this main subset of characters that function in this crew, this community-based, trying to progress from week to week. But you also have a detective kind of mystery plot line and also a political one as well. And I guess that's what I mean about its scope widening so far that one strand of those things I feel like inevitably suffers.
Yeah, I mean, season 1 and early season 2 were mostly focused on Earth politics, Earth-based ideas, Earth-based explorations, and I think what I really love about season 2 is how it introduces Mars and the Belters as, I guess the Belters are kind of a focus in season 1 because, we have the detective storyline going on over there and whatnot, but I do think that show, when its scope initially widened to include Mars and to bring characters like Bobby into the mix and to go down to, the Mars base that was settled that has the big accident there. I think if we kind of, the mystery of the proto-molecule and stuff is in the background for a lot of that and comes to the forefront in certain episodes, like when the detective finds Madam, or the super rich dude's daughter who got infected with the proto-molecule, who's the one who kind of started this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the mystery elements of this show worked as something, as kind of a, like a hamster on a treadmill to keep the lights on, as a way to fuel the rest of the series and give it some sense of drive so it didn't kind of feel like a big thought experiment. But I do think as the series continued on and that scope grew to include multiple perspectives from Mars, multiple perspectives from the Belters as they broke out into factions, all this beef on Earth, like the political part of season 4 on Earth it's probably the weakest thing that this entire series has done, with Ava Sorela's election, how she attempts to wade her way through that and then ultimately fails. We can look at characters like Ava Sorela and Bobby as the weak points of this 4th season, and I think you're correct that it's the scope. But I do think that there was at least an attempt to align all of those things early on that helped to drive it above some of these other series we're seeing now, like Lost in Space, or even what The Expanse has done since it's moved to Amazon.
But definitely, I agree, and it's a better problem to have than Lost in Space not really having any substance whatsoever. The things that keep a viewer coming back to Lost in Space, honestly, it's the release date. It being a show that was released around Christmas just makes a whole lot of sense. And I don't know if people would watch it at any other time of the year than when they're at home with family. A lot of kids who are off from school. That's the perfect time for Netflix to drop it. But other than that, kind of outside of the series itself context, its biggest strength is Parker Posey, who is ultimately not used well.
Yeah, and I think she's kind of the antithesis to a lot of what this series does. I think if we had a cast full of, or if the show just did what it does with her character consistently across everything that it does, all of its characters, how it constructs its storylines, I think it would be a much more interesting show, because Dr. Smith in this iteration, I don't know if you're familiar with the original Lost in Space, but the original Dr. Smith was also someone whose loyalties were ambiguous. They were kind of the person that set this whole thing in motion in the original series. They were an undercover agent for a foreign government. I don't think the government's ever named what government they came from, but they sabotaged the Jupiter and send them careening off into the middle of nowhere. And then, they're kind of forced to contend to live with that character. And ultimately, there was Lost in Space kind of lost its appeal when the show started skewing more towards that weird, off-putting perspective that the original actor of Dr. Smith gave off. I think in this show, Dr. Smith's character, who isn't given enough space, isn't given enough screen time, and comes in and out of the narrative in ways that are way, way, way too convenient. But I think that her character is kind of what I think great science fiction does really well, is take people with conflicted moralities, or at least interesting, unique points of view, put them in a strange place and challenge them at the very core of their being. Because if we really want to get into it, what Lost in Space tries to say about the Robinson family is that they have all these noble, altruistic qualities of brave explorers built into their DNA. It's the family DNA that does this. They are not molded by the world. They mold the world around them and their ability to be a strong, functioning unit. Dr. Smith, on the other hand, is a person who is completely out for herself at every single angle, makes no qualms about that. She's very honest about who she is. And I think the scenes that she has, especially, I'd say the first, like the end of season 1 through most of season 2, is kind of a really interesting exploration about a woman who just has no remorse, but also at the same time is starting to see the value of having family and having community and being able to tether yourself to something familiar and pleasant in such an unaccommodating space. Lost in Space is really bad, like we said, about how it creates how it challenges its characters in repetitive, uninteresting ways. But those consistent challenges do give this show the feeling of it being in an unexplored space. There's always a problem that's going to arise. There's always something that's going to come out of nowhere. And having a character that serves that purpose rather than gas or a four-armed robot or whatever other fucking dumb shit the Lost in Space used to justify its story beats. I don't know. I just gave the show a different rhythm at points that I really appreciated. Partly because Parker Posey's performance is so beyond anything else that show tries to do that it's the only times that it's genuinely interesting to watch.
And I definitely agree that if those obstacles that are thrown in are character-based, then they're much more interesting. All the technical stuff that accompanies it, I think, is strong. Parker Posey, most notably, but I do feel like Toby Stephens and Molly Parker are very talented performers, and especially I think the directors behind this, the production really hired incredibly talented people, like Game of Thrones and Hannibal alumni in David Nutter, Neil Marshall, Vincenzo Natali, Alex Graves. That flair is there. It's just when it's propping up something that is kind of empty in its writing, it's really hard to get excited about that, which is kind of my ultimate reaction to Lost in Space. It's hard to get excited about.
Yeah, and I would agree. This show is impossible to recommend for just about anybody except, families who want to get... It's a good introductory series, I guess, for families that want to get their kids into space science fiction. Just because shows like The Expanse, that topic matter is not for children. I can't really speak to Star Trek now, but I also think, the humor of, well, quote unquote, humor of the Orville or Avenue 5 would be lost on young kids. So, having a family show for a space family show is certainly a valid thing to have, but I just, at the end of the day, like you said, Molly Parker and Toby Stephens are great performers, but what does this show give them to work with? How many different ways can Molly Parker be overworked, exasperated genius mom and dad be gruff, emotionally, almost emotionally unavailable father soldier go? And this show really has nothing to prop it up with, and it gets worse once you get down to the kids in that family. So, yeah. I guess at the end of the day, where Lost in Space ultimately fails is its ability to write its own characters in interesting ways, because like you said, the production of it is really well done. Like, it looks nice, the places they go, the imagery they offer, especially in season 2 when they get away from the planet that they're on and they're careening through space trying to deal with whatever random issues are coming up each week. That stuff's interesting. It can be occasionally evocative. I think there's something to be said for how that show animates it's the main robot, who they fucking name Robot. It's the only thing they call it through the entire series, which, I mean, it's I guess it's better than some of the names they try to give the other robots, like Scarecrow or SARS, which I'm not even to get into how dumb it is to give something the name SARS on a television show. But yeah, it's weird. Lost in Space seems like an easy dunk for Netflix, but it's especially in the first season. The second season at least benefits from being they're both 10 episodes, but the second season is 2 hours shorter than the first season in its running time. And if anything, the brevity helps a bit because things move a little bit more, but my eyes roll over when I try and glaze in my face when I try and think about what the actual stories and arcs of these seasons were and why I cared about any of it.
Yeah, whereas maybe why I find it hard to engage with The Expanse sometimes is that there's so much to get invested in. It's almost like The Expanse is a franchise worth of material in one series.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, if I'm being honest with myself, like the emotional high point of that series probably came in season 2 when the detective finally comes across what happened to the woman he's been searching for, and he decides to stay there with her and give himself up and die with a planet. Like, there's something to be said for The Expanse's ability to tell such a, just a personally moving story about a man coming to the end of his life and realizing that he's kind of at the end of the road for himself, and how that kind of rippled out into being a literal universe-changing event for The Expanse and its characters. And, I could go on and on about people like Naomi Nagata, and, what an impact somebody like that has had, or even, Kamina, who's probably my favorite character on the show, or Amos. And, that show has, The Expanse is a great show because it's a great character show, not necessarily because it's an amazing science fiction show or a space show. It does do that stuff really, really well sometimes, especially when it's getting down into the details of how engines would operate in space and how to navigate thrust, like the nitty gritty stuff. They actually do a really interesting job with. But yeah, I do agree. I think this 4th season really showed that there is a limit to how big The Expanse can get before it kind of loses its luster. And also at the same time, how if it is to focus down on a single location like it does on this planet, that there isn't necessarily as much depth there as it seems. Because I think that the conflict on that planet was rather pointless and kind of castrates itself by turning it into this whole discovery of alien technology at the same time. I still think of these 2 shows, of any of the space shows we've talked about, really, The Expanse is the one to watch because it has the most to say. But I will agree with you that I think this 4th season in particular can be hard to grasp onto.
And I agree. I think this might be a case, which is often the case with me, of seeing a really good show and seeing that it could be even better, and somehow in my head, that's a worse crime than something with less ambition kind of just stagnating. So if more series looked at The Expanse as a blueprint, in the same way we mentioned last week, more things are definitely going to follow what The Mandalorian did structurally. If more sci-fi creators looked to The Expanse, I think sci-fi on TV in general would probably end up going into a better place.
Yeah, I think maybe that's one of the things The Expanse did so well that some other science fiction shows didn't, is that they had these arcs that would go over, in the case of Farscape or something, literally 20 to 30 episodes, sometimes encompassing over the entire arc of a season, and they would intersperse that with, okay, here's our low budget episode for the season, so we got to keep everybody on the ship, or we'll go to this one planet. But The Expanse's ability to kind of navigate between doing smaller stories and doing kind of medium scale half season arcs are its greatest strengths. And I think when it stretches things out to a full season like it does in season 1 and in season 4 is when it kind of begins to flounder a little bit.
That's space.
That's space, huh? I was trying to think if there was anything else prominent, any other really space-focused series, but there's not. And unfortunately, like I said, the future, I mean, if you're a Star Trek fan, I mean, I guess the future is kind of bright, but what is Star Trek Picard but a play on nostalgia for people that like the Next Generation? The answer remains to be seen, but the previews certainly lean hard into that in a way that makes me hesitant. And as somebody who appreciates and recognizes the importance and impact of Star Trek, but doesn't necessarily have an allegiance to it, definitely not excited for it. Patrick Stewart's great. Do we need more of him in a spacesuit, is my question.
I feel like we should wait for a particularly good or particularly bad horror series to do an episode like this on horror as well.
I don't understand how they haven't done a Dead Space series or even made a Dead Space movie. Like, how has that not happened yet?
You figure it's got to be in the pipeline somewhere. It's just a matter of
it's probably been in the pipeline. I'm sure at some point somebody, I'm not the first person to have this idea that say, I think Dead Space would make a really good movie. But like when you mention stuff like Dead Space and Mass Effect, I think Mass Effect's a little bit harder because of that series its storytelling reputation was kind of tarnished by its existence as a video game. Like all of the choice that they give you throughout the first 2 games of that series is kind of antithesis to what being a video game that has an ending is. So, we could go on for hours about the ending of Mass Effect and how they had to construct that ending so they had one ending and didn't have 14,000 endings for every individual player's wild journey as Shepard. But there is, I think The Expanse is the closest example we have to something that can find a middle ground. But like you said, sometimes it's even frustrating that show doesn't quite get there sometimes. And it's weird that we live in an age where there isn't kind of that signature prestige science fiction, unassailable work of science fiction. There's always been that throughout the generations, something that we can turn to when we want to think about what the future of civilization might be outside of Earth. And you'd think in this day and age where we are seriously considering the fact that we may have killed our own planet, that speculative kind of fiction would be more prominent. But, maybe we just don't have, like you said, maybe we just don't have the capacity to think about that in when we live on a planet that is in the active process of dying.
It might just be too real for people.
Shit is real, man. Shit's real. And on that note, I think we are done for the week. Like I said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us. Drop us a line, leave us a tweet, all that good stuff. Otherwise, if there's nothing else for you, Sean, I think we'll be back next week.
It'll be a really interesting episode next week, presumably with me sounding much better as well.
Yeah, next week we are going to, just for a little preview, Sean and I have been talking about action shows, and in particular, kind of, I think the last era of television was kind of a defining one for action on television, in particular, not just, people fighting each other, but just like the scale and scope of what action could be on television has changed in this, again, post Game of Thrones world. And we have a really fun discussion planned around that. So we will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, enjoy television?
Why not?